All right, today we're going to dive into some really complex research looking at the psychological outcomes of abortion. We're just going to neutrally walk through the findings from several key studies that focus on things like distress, decision-making, and the role of coercion.
So, here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the different kinds of abortion experiences that were reported in this research. Then, we'll compare the emotional outcomes, specifically relief versus distress. After that, we'll get into the study's findings on the link to suicide, and we'll wrap it all up by looking at what the researchers suggest this means for clinical care.
Okay, let's jump right in with our first section, the spectrum of experiences. The whole idea these studies are built on is that the context of the decision, why and how it was made, is absolutely critical to the psychological outcome.
So, the big takeaway from this research, right at the top, is that there's no single, one-size-fits-all abortion experience. The findings suggest that how a woman feels afterward really depends on whether the decision truly lined up with her own values and what she wanted.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting when you look at the data. According to the surveys, only about a third of abortions were described by the women as wanted and consistent with their personal values. That means a full two-thirds were described in a different way, as being inconsistent with their values, unwanted, or even coerced.
And just so we're all on the same page, let's be super clear about what the researchers mean by words like unwanted or coerced. For these studies, they're defining it specifically as a decision that a woman described as going against her own values, a choice made because of some kind of external pressure.
And that idea of pressure, well, it's a huge piece of the puzzle here. One study found that a pretty staggering 61% of women surveyed who'd had an abortion reported feeling a high level of pressure. The authors note this pressure could come from all sorts of places: a partner, family, or just intense financial worries.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now let's move on and see how these different types of decisions actually connect to the emotional outcomes that were reported in the studies.
And this right here, this really highlights a central point from the research. The idea that relief is the main feeling after an abortion isn't necessarily universal. According to this data, relief was the #1 emotion only for that subgroup whose abortions were wanted and lined up with their values. For the other groups in the study, negative emotions like grief and guilt were actually reported as being more dominant than relief.
So what's the big picture here? Well, when the researchers zoomed out and looked at the entire group of participants all together, they found that overall, emotions like grief, guilt, and regret were actually reported as being more common and more dominant than relief.
And you might think, okay, but these feelings probably fade, right? Well, according to a separate analysis, that's not always the case. It found that nearly 45% of post-abortive women still reported moderate to high levels of emotional distress connected to their abortion, an average of 20 years after it happened.
Okay, we're now getting to what is, without a doubt, the most sensitive part of this research, which looks at self-harm risk. We're going to approach this very calmly and clinically, and it's just really important to remember these are the specific findings and interpretations of the study's authors.
So take a look at this chart. What this study found was a really significant difference in the lifetime rate of attempted suicide depending on the pregnancy outcome. The highest rate, at 46.2%, was among women who reported having had a coerced abortion. Now compare that to 29.5% for those with a wanted abortion and 13.4% for women in the study who had only ever given birth.
You know, a common question is, could this just be because of pre-existing mental health issues? Well, that's exactly what this study looked into. And according to the author, the idea that you can explain it all away with prior mental health problems just doesn't seem to line up with what the women themselves were reporting about the role their abortion played.
And that leads to this next number, which is, well, it's pretty stark. The research found that women who had a coerced abortion were 24 times more likely than women who only gave birth to say the abortion itself was a major contributing factor in a suicide attempt. Again, it's really important to remember this is based on the women's own self-reported connection between the two events.
So after laying out all this data, the big question is, now what? What's the takeaway? What do the researchers actually propose as a path forward? That's what this last section is all about.
So it all really boils down to this. The authors conclude that their findings point to a real need for better clinical care, especially when it comes to pre-abortion screening. It's basically a call to action for the medical community. And they don't just leave it there. They actually suggest a pretty clear three-step approach for doctors and clinics. First, they say you need to screen patients specifically for any pressure to abort against their own values. Second, if a patient is identified as being at risk, they should be informed about the potential for negative mental health outcomes. And finally, third, offer counseling to give them a space to work through any unresolved feelings.
And that's where we'll leave it. You know, the research we just walked through paints a really complex picture. It moves past the idea of a single, universal experience and leaves us with this really big question, which is at the heart of the researchers' recommendations. How can our healthcare systems get better at screening for and responding to the incredibly diverse emotional needs that surround this decision?